Hey, good morning, church family. I hope that you all are doing well. If you're like me, at this point, I'm kind of tired of sitting and watching a screen for many hours, it seems, every day. But nonetheless, I'm glad that you're here with me, ready to get into the scriptures a little bit. We are in Matthew chapter 23 uh, today. And if you haven't read that passage yet, I encourage you pause the video, go and read Matthew chapter 23. And then come back and we'll talk about it a little bit. At this point in the book of Matthew, if you've been following along, Jesus is already in the city of Jerusalem. He's made his triumphal entry. And so we're here and Jesus is preparing to go to the cross. Um, the first thing that really sticks out to me in chapter 23 is that if we have any picture of Jesus as just um, a gentle man in his time on earth. I think that this chapter kind of blows that description out of the water. Jesus is gentle and kind and loving, but he's also described as a lion who protects his people and his church relentlessly. And this chapter is a roar against the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees. Um, he says some pretty shocking things here. Um, you know, the most of the time when we think of wolves that are infiltrating the church, we think of it as such wolves that are coming into the church, and the wolves really in the church in Jerusalem are the leaders. It says that the scribes and Pharisees, they sit on Moses's seat, so they're the ones that are teaching. They know the Torah inside and out, and yet they are the ones that are leading people to destruction. And Jesus says that we're to listen to what they preach, but do not do what they practice. And then he goes on to list his seven woes. And so I just want to look at a couple of those things. First off, in verse 13, they shut the kingdom in people's faces. So they neither enter the kingdom the nor do they allow other people to enter the kingdom. They're actually shutting the door in people's faces. And then he says, even furthermore in verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across the land to make a single proselyte or convert. And when he becomes a convert, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. How is that even possible? Well, you take somebody who's unsaved and you give them a false gospel, a gospel that's built on works, and you screw them up. They're 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 twice a child of hell, as he says there. Verse 24, the Pharisees, they're concerned with the minute details. They go down even for tithing. They tithe a tenth of their mint and dill and cumin, but they neglect justice and mercy and faithfulness. They miss the big picture. Jesus says that it's like they go in and they fish out little gnats from their cup of wine, and they go to take a sip of it, and it's like they swallow a whole camel, which is, of course, hyperbole. But a camel is an unclean animal just as much as a gnat is. And so they're going and looking at the little details of the law and missing the giant big picture: justice, mercy, God's heart for his people. And perhaps most egregiously in verse 30, the Pharisees say that they would not be like their forefathers, that they would not put to death the prophets that are sent to God's people to share about the kingdom, and yet they stood in opposition to John the Baptist and to Jesus. They've opposed him through his entire ministry, and a couple chapters from now, they're going to say his blood is on our hands. Right? So they say these things, and yet they're hypocrites. And the thing about the Pharisees is that they looked great on the outside. Jesus says that they cleaned the outside of their cup relentlessly, and that they were filthy on the inside. And my take on this, my kind of understanding of this, is that the Pharisees, they were so consumed on making the outside of their cup look clean that they convinced themselves that they were good, that they didn't need grace. And so when the grace of Christ showed up and slapped them in the face, trying to get them to realize their sin, they rejected it. They failed to be amazed at grace because they didn't think they needed it. So you may have read this passage and thought, wow, that's intense language that's aimed towards a very specific people group, the scribes and the Pharisees. And I want us to be careful um, to not write ourselves out of the warnings here in this passage. My question for you is, as you read this and as you sit in your living room watching this today, I want you to ask the question of yourself, are you amazed at grace? Perhaps you're watching this in the morning. Do you understand your need for new mercy today? For the sins that you committed yesterday or the day before that, or even this morning, as your children were maybe running around, or your roommate was getting on your nerves and you lashed out in anger. Do you realize your desperate need for grace? My hope, my prayer for you is that you would take some time this morning to confess your sins before God, who is gracious to forgive you. And then you would take a moment to just revel and be amazed at the grace of Christ, the grace that these scribes and Pharisees missed. Don't miss it today or tomorrow or the next day. It is that grace that promises us everlasting life with Christ forevermore. Don't miss him, friends. I miss you all, and I hope that you're well. I hope that you will take some time this morning to just sit and pray and be amazed at the grace of Christ. Bye, all.